My special guest this morning joins me from Columbia University in the city of New York. He is a professor with the departments of Religion, African American Studies, and African Diaspora Studies. His most recent book, Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. This book was published by Penguin Random House and can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Enjoy the show. Professor Hendricks, thank you so much for making the time. I'm happy to have you today.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
That is wonderful. I'll get us quickly started. I would want you to start by just telling us what you consider to be your research interests, the work that you're currently doing, that includes the classes that you are teaching, the research that you've been doing, and publications that you've been doing before this particular work.
Yeah, I am by training, my PhD is in religions of late antiquity, and I focus on early Christianity, but not from a theological standpoint, but principally from a political standpoint. And so my first career was on Wall Street in finance, and so I sort of married in its settings in life. My first publication was actually a work of historical fiction called it's entitled Living Water, and it's an African American retelling of the story of the woman at the well in the Gospel of John, a woman who was had been married to five husbands and was living with a man, not her husband. And I wrote that really because many preachers, and I can't say I'm fond of a lot of preachers and what they say, but many preachers use that against the interests of women. Talk about this woman as a gold digger. And they don't pay attention to the fact that women didn't have the right to initiate marriage or divorce in that time. So this woman would have been 5 times chattel. So I tried to look at what such a woman's life might have looked like as 5 times chattel. And I do it from an African-American perspective, using African-American vernacular and Southern culture. But at the same time, I'm very true to the setting in life in first century Israel.
Mm-hmm.
My second book is my most popular book. Many have called it a rediscovering the true revolutionary nature of Jesus' teachings and how they have been corrupted. And I look at the politicality of the gospel, the political dimension of the gospel. My next book was a book of essays. The universe bends toward justice, and my most recent book is Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. And currently, I've been teaching for the first time in the religion department at Columbia. Of course, I'm offering a course called the a political introduction to the Christian scriptures. And my main point in focusing on on the Christian scriptures is that Christian gospel has been used as a cudgel of oppression for centuries and centuries. It's been in service to terrible patriarchy, terrible white supremacy, other forms of oppression, and I'm working to counteract that, to correct those terrible oppressions and transgressions against the gospel. That's mainly what I'm doing. And today, currently, I'm doing a lot of reading in political economy and political philosophy, and I'm looking to formulate or to propose a form of political economy of justice based on what Jesus identified as the greatest social commandment, and that is love your neighbor as yourself. Which means, of course, that we are to the same right to a decent subsistence. We got to want that for our neighbors as we would want that for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a further implication, and that implication is, since we all will struggle for ourselves and our families to have the best,
Mm-hmm.
To have full freedoms, to have full economic, political, and social mobility, and a decent subsistence. That commandment also, it commands us to struggle for our neighbors to have the same.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about that, what the command then is telling us is to work for the common good of all folks, which is a socialist ethos. It's not socialism, but a socialist ethos, because it's concerned about the whole society. And so I'm looking to formulate a form of political economy that is consistent with that, without it being theologically onerous or anything like that. And I understand that I'm looking for it to be consistent with the formulation of the philosopher Josiah Royce, A Beloved Community, which Martin Luther King picked up, but he died before he had the opportunity to flesh it out. Well, I'm looking to flesh that out and giving it some form. So that's primarily what I'm doing now. I'm also working with a working group under the auspices of the PRI Incorporated, this major polling organization on whose board I sit. And we are working on strategies to counteract this white Christian nationalism, this right-wing evangelicalism that's looking to prop up Donald Trump and to dominate our whole society, make us all genuflect at the altar of their very narrow, oppressive, and racist and sexist ideology. So that's where I am at this point.
Interesting. I have a follow-up, but I think it's best I ask it after the one I have right now. But so what do you consider to be the core ideas of this book, Christians Against Christianity, and what is its central argument?
The core idea really is that right-wing Christian evangelicalism, I guess, which is interchangeable with Christian nationalism, is that their premises, the premises on which right-wing evangelicalism are built, are really anathema to the very gospel they claim that they are presenting to America, and that they're really that Christianity is really ideological Christianity, meaning that Christianity is refracted through the prism of the interests of these right-wing evangelicalism, and their interests are based in racism and in an authoritarian dominationist ideology. It looks to make, as I said earlier, make the whole nation genuflect at the altar of their narrow and distorted view of the gospel. Central argument. Okay. And so I look in the book. I look at some of the things that they base their that they claim to be the main things that we should be concerned about. For instance, their view of who Jesus is. They distort Jesus as some kind of apolitical, some apolitical figure whose only concern is otherworldly, and has no concern at all for the suffering of the people, although he talks about poverty and suffering of people more than anything other than God. Now, so I look at some of their concerns, like their the way that, well, some of them actually call social justice uh, uh, anti-biblical.
Okay.
And so in the book, I show that in no uncertain terms that the basic ethical premise of the biblical tradition is social justice. Very briefly, the ethical concept that occurs in the Bible more than any other is the concept of justice, mishpat, justice. We translate that as justice or judgment, meaning judging between right and wrong, good and evil. It occurs over 400 times. And the second most often occurring ethical concept is the Hebrew term tzedakah, which we translate usually as personal piety, individual personal piety. But that is not really the meaning of the term, because there's no sense of, there's not even a term for individual in biblical Hebrew. It's and the ethos is always communal. It's never like Ubuntu, right?
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
It's never individualistic. So that term, tzedakah, the second most oft occurring ethical term in the biblical tradition, would mean not righteousness as personal piety, but doing right by others, doing right in society, practicing justice in society. What's interesting is that these two terms, mishpat and tzedakah, they justice, which is egalitarian justice in the biblical tradition, and mishpat, and then tzedakah, which means doing justice, doing right in society. They are paired more than any other terms in the Bible. They occur throughout every part of the Bible. And when you put them together, justice, doing justice in society, that's social justice. And that and that's that can't be contradicted. So I show that as a premise for what the gospel tradition is about. And then I go on to show how right-wing evangelicalism transgresses that in so many significant ways, not the least of which is that you never hear them talk about love. You never hear them talk about loving neighbor as ourselves. Just the opposite. It's a lot of hateful invective, a lot of oppositional discourse. You hear more about who they oppose than who they embrace, and that is anathema to the really. It's the anathema to the biblical tradition. It is just, in a sense, it's heretical.
Interesting. So you told me earlier on that you're doing some readings on political economy, and as well you just introduced and told me this term socialist ethos. You said socialism, and you also said socialist ethos. Do you think that the teachings of Jesus Christ are synonymous with those of Karl Marx and those that formulate what we call socialism today?
No, it's a socialist ethos. We might say a communal ethos. No, and it's not. It's not. Any modern political philosophy, all the modern political philosophies are just that. They are. They aren't. I mean, they might embrace communalism. They're not synonymous with the biblical tradition. No, I say socialist ethos, not socialism. And because, as you know, there are a myriad forms of socialism, from the most authoritarian to the most Bernsteinian, meaning that it's really like Sanders or Martin Luther King, for instance, was a democratic socialist.
Okay.
And he said that he believed that that there should be universal health care, right? Universal basic income on down the line. But the democratic dimension of it is that those should only become policies if people vote them in democratically. So there's no authoritarianism. So I glad you asked that question. I wouldn't want that to be confused.
Interesting. So now, how does your book contribute to the conventional discourse on Christian evangelism, particularly in the context of the United States?
Yeah, well, one thing that I show is the roots of evangelicalism that go back to the 18th century on up, and the early evangelicals, many of them were about justice. Many of them were anti-slavery, and they were about working for the common good. Now, of course, there were racist elements, but what's usually lost is that these evangelicals, they're evangelicals who stood up for unions, actually, and who wrote anti-slavery tracts. In fact, most abolitionists, the abolitionist movement was an evangelical movement in America. So I want to show the roots of it, but also to show when it shifted. And the emphasis of evangelicalism shifted. I think its first real shift was in the 1930s. And believe it or not, it was it became evangelicalism was subsumed by anti-New Deal politicians and businessmen, and they were businessmen. There were no women involved, and we're talking about business elites, the richest people. They were upset with the New Deal because the New Deal was the first time that the government recognized that it had a responsibility for what Jesus called the least of these in society. And those who were so used to who were the rich and so used to government serving their needs and being focused on using government to make themselves richer, well, of course, they had a big problem with that. And so they started something called the American Liberty League. The DuPont brothers were among the founders, and other rich capitalists, and they claimed that they were about protecting American liberty by standing against the New Deal. And they brought into their fold a man, James Fifield, and Reverend James Fifield in California, to give a religious veneer to their anti-New Deal, their anti-New Deal efforts. And from that time, James Fifield started something called spiritual mobilization, although there's no evidence that ever tried to spiritually mobilize anyone. It was always about upholding the rights and the perquisites of the rich. And so from that time, right-wing evangelicalism became, they started using socialism as the term socialism, to demonize, to characterize, and to mischaracterize and demonize any efforts to make the country more economically just.
Yes.
And then from there, I think the next step was the next big step that accounts for the right-wing evangelical movement we have today, the one that supports one of the most destructive, irreligious, lying, pathologically lying sociopaths ever on the American scene, Donald Trump. This movement that supports him, their roots are traced to the very diseased soil of racism. But before I explain that, I just want to share something from President Harry Truman about socialism, to show Harry Truman was very much alarmed by by the way these efforts, the New Deal efforts, were being used to help America's poor. He was alarmed by the way they were demonized as socialism, like that's a horrible thing, like killing babies. And so he said, socialism is a scare word they've hurled at every advance the people have made in the last 20 years. He said that in the 50s. Socialism is what they called public electric power. Socialism is what they call social securities, on and on. Socialism is what they call bank deposit insurance. It's what they call the growth and of free and independent labor organizations. Begins by saying socialism is their name for almost anything that helps all the people. And so we saw that demonization began with the American Liberty League and the capitalists in the 30s and 40s. And we see that same strategy used today. And so it was in 1973, though, that the foundation for this very pernicious right-wing evangelical movement we have today, that this movement began. Now, many evangelicals say today that their movement began in opposition to Roe versus Wade, the legalization of abortion on demand. But actually, this movement began instead when the IRS under President Jimmy Carter ruled that all educational institutions no institution that practices racial segregation as a policy, that all those organizations would be ineligible to receive federal funding. And so in 1971 and thereabouts, these evangelicals railed against that. In fact, they had their cause célèbre was an institution called Bob Jones University, which was a terribly racist university. And these evangelicals said they supported Bob Jones' right to be racially segregated. They came together and they were angry. They already gotten angry about the civil rights movement and the civil rights the Civil Rights Amendment of the 60s, but they really came together behind their support of the right of folks to be racially exclusive and racially discriminatory. And so from that time, so that brought them together. But it was in the early 80s when they really pulled it together, and that is when a group of the top right-wing evangelicals came together to decide what issues they would use, what they call wedge issues, to divide the American people, to whip up American people to be on their side, so they could gain control over the body politic of America. And they chose two issues. And this is all documented in Randy Balmer's book, Thy Kingdom Come. Randy Balmer teaches at Dartmouth University. And the two wedge issues they said that they would use to whip up the American people to support these right-wing evangelicals in their quest to take over America were homosexuality and gay marriage and abortion. These were wedge issues. Prior to that, abortion was not a major issue for these people. And so we see since that time, since the 80s, this is what they've done. This is a strategy they've used, and they've used it to great effect. In fact, they were successful with Roe v. Wade, but they made abortion a virtual litmus test when the Bible does not ever speak against abortion at all. The New Testament never mentions it. Jesus never mentions it. The only place in the Bible where voluntary abortion is mentioned is in the book of Numbers, chapter 5, in which it says that if a woman is found to be pregnant by a man other than her husband, that God will abort the fetus she is carrying as punishment. So the only abortion we have in the Bible is a divine abortion. But look how they made abortion this major litmus test, political litmus test for throughout the nation.
Oh, I see. So now I want us to get into the, I don't know if I should call it philosophical discussion of, the kind of maybe argument that you pose in the title. You say Christians against Christianity. And, from my understanding of it, if they are against Christianity, they can't qualify to be and carry the title Christian in the very first place. So what is your understanding, or what is your definition of Christianity?
Well, my definition really doesn't count. Of course, what Jesus says, the greatest commandments are to love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And as I said earlier, the greatest social commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Just in this one instance, right-wing evangelicals, Christian nationalists, they never talk about love at all. In fact, their rhetoric is very hateful towards certain neighbors, and in fact against all neighbors except those who believe as they believe and who largely look like they look, unless you're going to be a sort of a mascot, honorary white person like Clarence Thomas or Tim Scott. I think I don't need to explain that. It's pretty obvious who they've cast their lot with. And so I say that it's Christians against Christianity, in that what we see is an ideological Christianity that is based on the interests of a certain group of folk who call themselves Christians versus biblical Christianity, or we might call it even anti-Christianity, because I'm going to give you a couple examples. So Jesus says, talks about the Good Samaritan, that how one should sacrifice to take care of those who are wounded and in need. And he talks about the responsibility to care, for each other. In fact, that's throughout the biblical witness. But right-wing evangelicals, they largely embrace this a libertarianism that is about individualism, that says you really don't have a responsibility to care for others. It's okay if you want to, but you don't have a responsibility to do that. That is the opposite of the gospel message. And in other ways, they stand against the gospel message. Jesus talks about taking care of the least of these. Their libertarianism says that they want to unravel the strands of the social safety net, and some of them say that that the best thing we can do for poor and suffering folk is to allow them to suffer more, because that'll drive them to the cross so they can be born again. You see, this is not consistent with the biblical witness. More than that, the biblical witness, the gospel witness, is about love. Jesus says, love your neighbors, and he talks about it in very concrete ways. When Luke shows as his very first public sermon, he says, the Spirit of the Lord's upon me, he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, and on, and liberation to the oppressed, which is the way that verse should be translated correctly, well, anyway, is liberation to the oppressed. Well, they don't believe in that at all. In fact, they talk about dominating America, not liberating America. And one more thing, these people talk about freedom all the time, freedom of religion, freedom of this, but the biblical witness is based on not freedom to do things, whatever you want, but responsibility to others, to the community. And you never hear them talk about responsibility for the common good. It's always it's always this individualism. It's always this oppositional discourse, and that really militates against the spirit of the gospel.
Can we? It's sometimes it's very hard to be to practice collective justice, collective good, collective welfare in a capitalistic society.
Yes,
given the context of capitalism, it's very hard. We like even morality itself is hard to talk about.
Yeah.
In that given context. So, are we moving towards a time when the gospel is supposed to attack this institution of capitalism so that it can be a gospel that addresses the elephant in the room?
Yeah. Well, capitalism is not about the common good, right? Capitalism puts profits above people, and capitalism believes in and it thrives on the oppression of workers and laborers, and it thrives on what they call free markets, meaning markets that don't well protect consumers. So there's so it thrives on manipulating consumers, often cheating consumers. And its capitalism is anti-democratic because whoever has the most capital can control the most votes, and so one person, one vote doesn't stand. Though the gospel is Christianity is a religion, but it has this underlying ethics, which about treating people well. We see Jesus, the so-called cleansing of the temple, throwing the money changers out, throwing their money on the floor was about people being. He stood up and physically stood against exploitation, financial exploitation of the people, which was one of the reasons why he stood against the priestly aristocracy. I talk about that in more length in my book, The Politics of Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, our part of the task of those who take the gospel message seriously, to make this a world of love and justice, part of that task is to try to transform capitalism into a form of political economy that values human life, that values justice, and stands for fairness. And that's the direction of the work I'm trying to accomplish now, realizing that all forms of political economy have changed into something else. We had feudalism, then and during feudalism, folk never thought feudalism would end. Then we had mercantilism. Folk never thought that would end. And so we're in capitalism, and capitalist logic, and capitalist logic says that has us believing that capitalism is normative and it's the end of civilization, that this is it. But this has to change as well, because human beings will change. And so I think what Christianity offers, the ethics of the biblical witness offers us some guidelines for how we might look to transform to transform capitalism into something that is more humane, and more based on justice, knowing that we'll never have perfect justice, but we can get better justice and a more loving society. Yes.
Interesting. My last question for you: what's the what's the target audience of this book? Who do you think would greatly benefit? On the, like, broadly speaking, if they are to get their hands on this book.
Yeah. Well, one thing I didn't say earlier is the way that the book Christians Against Christianity, the way it engages Donald Trump and his followers, his evangelical followers. That aspect of the book, I think, is important for all Americans to be aware of, because a lot of folk are fooled into thinking that this is a normal human being, and not a man who purveys evil. And many of them are led by their religious leaders to believe that somehow this man, literally, it's been written and many have said literally that he is a modern Messiah in the religious sense. I mean, actually, there's a recent book called Donald Trump, Son of God, Son of Man. I mean, all of this. So I try to show how support of Donald Trump is really anti-Christian. It's militates against everything Christianity stands for. So I think everyone would benefit from that. And also for those who know that there's something wrong with this right-wing evangelicalism and Christian nationalism, but don't really cannot really articulate what it is. I try to explain to them why the support of the NRA by right-wing evangelicals, how that is so pernicious and so anti-Christian, because the right-wing evangelicals are the ones who support the death dealing of goals and philosophy that NRA. I try to explain to them the biblical witness on the way immigrants should be treated and why, and even tithing, for instance, that a lot of preachers talk about. Tithing was instituted in part to help support immigrants until they're able, to land on their own feet.
Oh, interesting. Tell me something about that.
Well, the biblical witness says, throughout, in fact, as a result of the Exodus, we're told that the stranger, the Hebrew, the ger, the stranger, which includes immigrants, should always be welcome. That they should be welcome into community. That they should have the same rights as everyone else. They should not be forced to conform to religion or ideology. They must respect, of course, the laws and respect religious policies, but they should not be forced to assimilate, or their lack of assimilation should not be used against them. But the Bible says that the stranger should always be treated with respect, and that as I said, the stranger should have all the same rights as anybody else. In other words, treated as a full human being. That's what the biblical witness says throughout there since the Exodus. Why? Because the Exodus says we also were strangers or immigrants in a strange land. So we should treat others that way. I also look at homosexuality. It seems to be it's commonly accepted that the Bible says in the final analysis that same gender intimacy, sexual intimacy, is a sin. And what I try to show that when we translate these handful of sayings and look at them in their setting in life, it's not clear at all that we're being told that those who are born same gender loving people, that they are sinful. And I take great pains to show that, particularly the verses having that are found in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, because some of them seem to explicitly talk about how cross-dressing is a sin, man lying with a man is a sin, but I'm going to step back from that. We go back to Sodom and Gomorrah, where the understanding begins. Nowhere does it say that these men who wanted to gang rape the guests of the prophet Lot, that they were homosexuals. He said they wanted to gang rape them, and nowhere does it say that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because of homosexuality. And what's left out is that Lot said, well, no, don't gang rape my male guests who turn out to be angels. No, instead, let me give you my daughters to gang rape. That's left out. That's left out of it. And what's also lost is that wherever Sodom and Gomorrah is referred to in the Bible, throughout the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, nowhere does it say that it was destroyed for homosexuality. It was said it was destroyed for lack of hospitality, because not showing hospitality to a stranger in that kind of desert setting could mean a death sentence. And so I show that this whole thing about the Sodomites and Sodom and Gomorrah, that it has nothing to do in the Bible. It says nothing about homosexuality, but it says that the reason it was destroyed was because of essentially for homosexuality and other unclean practices. So things like that I try to explain to folks so they'll see that this emphasis on homosexuality now as another litmus test does go back to the 80s, when these evangelicals got together and decided we're going to use homosexuality to whip people up and to get them to support us. Those are the kinds of things I talk about. I talk about, as I said, the NRA. One other thing I look at is unions. How the right-wing evangelicals fight against unions, and unions are the last bulwark that workers have against exploitation by big capital. And we had, like, Billy Graham once likened unions to snakes and disease. He said, in heaven there'll be no unions, no snakes, no diseases. And so this is right-wing evangelicalism is also anti-worker, and that's something that most people don't realize, but they need to know. And so in that sense, working against workers who are fighting for a living wage, fighting for decent living, decent working condition and living conditions, how this goes. This is anathema to the gospel witness. And so these people are fighting against against their own interests, most of them, because most Americans are laborers and workers. These are the kinds of things that I try to bring to the public consciousness.
That's wonderful. I can see it's really a broad spectrum of an audience that will greatly benefit from this. We can talk for several minutes, if not hours, about these issues, but I'm very grateful of the time that you have made to talk about this particular book. Viewers and listeners, those of you who are interested in getting a copy of this book, you can just click the link that is right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Professor Hendricks, thank you so much for making the time today.
Well, thank you so much for your for the time and for your very searching questions, and very searching and intelligent and well-informed questions. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you so much.